Hi, I'm Elaine LaChapelle, Head of Membership and Leadership Development here at AREA. And today I'm speaking with Tom Abbott. Tom is the co-founder and CEO of AMC NPO Solutions, and he's an authority on governance. He has over 25 years experience as a CEO, a president, and director of several not-for-profit organizations. He's an author and a certified speaking professional. And Tom has agreed to come today and talk to us about some of the points that he shared at our recent Peak Leadership Summit, specifically on setting ethical standards for board governance. Hey, Tom, how are you?
I'm doing great, Elaine. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. And thank you for joining us today.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Um, I wanted to talk about this topic because we're seeing that ethics is at the board level is more important now than ever before. And members and the public seem to have a higher expectations when it comes to ethical behavior from their associations. So I wondered if you could start by talking about how associations go about setting ethical standards.
Well, that's a great question, Elaine. And I think just to kind of build upon my session at the Peak Leadership Conference not too long ago, I think it really starts with board members understanding their responsibilities, right? Like that's really where it starts. So we've got traditional responsibilities of a board, strategic planning, approving the financial direction of the organization and whatnot. But there are some legislated responsibilities that are explicit in law that all directors must be aware of. So number one, directors must act honestly, in good faith, and in the best interests of the organization. That's first and foremost. That's paramount. And number two is directors must exercise care, diligence, and skill of a reasonably prudent person, whatever that looks like and whatever that means. But really, if board members can start by just looking at those two legislative responsibilities, acting in honestly, in good faith, and in the best interests of the organization and the organization alone, and exercising care, diligence, and skill of a reasonably prudent person, your organization is already moving in the right direction.
So I think a lot of organizations attempt that, but it's difficult. Why is it so difficult at times for board directors to live up to that standard?
I think it's difficult because these responsibilities, as I describe them, sometimes for some people in certain situations can seem subjective. I mean, what exactly is a reasonably prudent person? Now, you and I might go, come on, I mean, reasonably prudent. But for others, they go, well, what does that mean? Like, what does prudent mean and what does reasonably prudent mean? I mean, if there's anything that we've seen in the last few years around, politics and whatnot, reasonably prudent people might be hard to come by. And what does that even mean? What does that look like? So I think coming up with a common definition of prudence and reasonable, that's subjective, can be tricky. And operating in the best interest of the organization, well, maybe some directors feel as though putting themselves in a potential conflict, maybe, but I'm genuinely still acting in the best interest of the organization. Never mind, I happen to be in a conflict of interest. So there's murky waters all the way around, and I think that's why it's harder to do what seems easy to do.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. Maybe you could talk about some of the things that get boards into trouble that they might not anticipate in those gray, murky areas.
Well, I mean, let me just, build upon what I was mentioning about conflict of interest. I think that is probably one of the areas where most board members find themselves getting in trouble unintentionally, right? They're not trying to. Quite often, they don't mean to. Conflict of interest is something where I don't feel that most directors who are in a conflict or a perceived conflict intend to put themselves in that position. They just may not be aware of it. But I think conflict of interest is a really tricky one. I mean, when we talk about what exactly is a conflict of interest, this is where a lot of people actually go wrong as well. But really, a conflict of interest is any situation where your personal interests or those of a close friend, family member, business associate, corporation, or partnership in which you hold a significant interest, or a person to whom you owe an obligation, could, not would, could influence your decisions and impair your ability to act in the society's best interests or represent the society fairly, impartially, and without bias. So it's really important here to note that a conflict of interest exists if the decision could be influenced. It's not necessary that influence actually takes place.
That's a really good clarification and changes the perception of that entirely from a director's perspective. Because what I've seen is that directors are hesitant to express a conflict of interest because it may sound like they're doing something wrong.
Right.
Right. But they're not doing anything wrong. They're anticipating what could be perceived as a problem. So
well, I think something
excellent.
I mentioned during my session, Elaine, is when a director feels that they might be, could be, possibly in a potential conflict, is there are 4 R's. I call them the 4 R's of conflict of interest. And how do you handle them? Number 1, you have to reveal right away. Just reveal. Hey, you know what? I think I might be in a conflict of interest. Reveal it. Number 2, recuse yourself. Okay, I believe I might be in a conflict. Just to avoid any appearance of impropriety, I'm going to recuse myself from this discussion, this debate, this conversation. Certainly the vote, but I'm not even going to participate in the conversation to not influence it one way or another. The third is I will actually remove myself. I will physically remove myself from the meeting space or the Zoom meeting that we're having right now, and you all just let me back in. I'll stay in the waiting room. You let me back in after you have voted on this. And then and when I'm out, don't be texting people and chatting there to find out, hey, what's going on? What's going on? No. Right? So recuse comes, okay, so first it's reveal, recuse, remove, and then you can return. So those are the 4 R's of handling conflict of interest. Reveal, recuse, remove, and return.
Excellent. Very helpful. I was wondering, has COVID changed the ethical standards that associations need to think about? Things like remote meetings, remote voting, working from home. Are there additional standards that have had to be considered?
I mean, obviously, COVID changed everything, right? I mean, strategic planning sessions never planned for a global pandemic that would forever, possibly forever, change the way we live and work and interact. As far as ethical standards, I think it's pretty much the same. I don't feel that COVID has changed that in a sense. Some of the things that you mentioned, I think, are more, operational. They're guidelines, sort of work from home measures and policies around, use of technology. So, in fact, use of technology that does fall within some codes of conduct, for example. So it actually does touch on it a little bit because now people are using possibly company equipment or association equipment at home. So you just want to make sure that all of your policies are up to date, which kind of leads me to something that I wanted to talk about the importance of actually having codes of conduct. So I'm happy to elaborate on that if you want.
Yeah, because it falls in. The last question I wanted to ask you was to share the top 3 things that you think associations can do
Oh,
to set
perfect.
the high ethical standards. So that will be probably number 1.
Okay. Well, so certainly, if there were 3 things, and 3 is kind of the magic number. I love the power of these. If there were 3 things that needed to happen, it would be a director's code of conduct. So how do we as directors conduct ourselves? What can we do? What should we not do? How do we handle certain situations? There should be a CEO code of conduct for the CEO, the ED, the executive officer, for example, and a conflict of interest policy. If a board starts with these 3 things, you're going to be in really good shape.
And I just want to comment because we find this with our associations that we work with, that it can be challenging to have consequences for people who do not abide by the code of conduct. Could you comment on that, how difficult that can be, and if there's any way that boards can overcome their concern or fear of actually implementing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. And I think it all starts with everybody being on the same page. So the board collectively develops codes of conduct for directors, and the board agrees to those. As you're onboarding new directors, have the chair or the past chair or the vice chair, however you decide in your organization, sit down with the new board member, go through the conflict of interest guidelines with them, go through the director's code of conduct with them, ask them, do you have any questions or comments or thoughts about this? Do you agree to adhere to these? Do these seem reasonable? Perfect. Can I get your signature on this document, please? Then, if down the road the board feels that this director is in a potential real or perceived conflict of interest, or breaches any of the codes of conduct, can bring that up safely, confidentially, privately at first, and say, hey Julie, hey Jane, hey John, kind of looks like you might be in a conflict of interest here, or hey, you're not the official spokesperson for the society. You're not supposed to say stuff like that, right? Have that initial conversation, see if it can be settled. If not, you bring it up at the board level, and then you take action. But things have to be done because the board has to see that we take these things seriously. And the last thing we want are rogue directors just going off and doing their own thing that might undermine the work of the board.
Those policies aren't worth much if they aren't adhered to. Exactly.
100%. And look, if we look at the climate that's happening right now around the world, when people say something, they've got to actually back it up. Otherwise, bad things happen.
Right. Talking about this, but thank you so much, Tom. I've been speaking with Tom Abbott, author and governance expert, and you can learn more about Tom at amcnposolutions.com.